6 Japanese carriers launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. By the autumn of 1944, only one of them was still afloat. 300 aircraft were already in the air, and the last carrier from Pearl Harbor had nothing left to put up against them.
It was a little before 10 in the morning, on the 25th of October, 1944, about 200 miles northeast of Cape Engaño, at the northern tip of Luzon. A torpedo dropped by an American Avenger struck the Japanese aircraft carrier Zuikaku on her port side, forward of the after engine room. It took away her steering. It silenced her main radio. She was still making 20 knots when it hit, and she was the largest, fastest, most experienced carrier the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever put to sea. The aircraft that found her that morning had flown from a ship whose crew had never laid eyes on her before. They were guided to her by a man circling at 19,000 feet. He could see her flight deck more clearly than her own lookouts could see the sky. Vice Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo had taken 4 aircraft carriers north that week. By nightfall, he had none. Zuikaku was on the bottom, with roughly 840 of her company still aboard, and her captain had chosen to remain with them. It was less a battle than a debt being collected in daylight, and the debt was not collected by a fleet. It was collected by a system, radar, a control room, a fighter that outclimbed anything Japan had left, a training pipeline, and shipyards that replaced losses faster than Japan could inflict them. Zuikaku was not outfought off Cape Engaño. She had been outbuilt for 3 years, and Cape Engaño was simply where the arithmetic arrived. The air group overhead that morning flew from a carrier named Lexington. There had been an earlier Lexington. Zuikaku's own aircraft had sent her to the bottom. But this does not begin off Cape Engaño. It begins at Kure on the 25th of September, 1941, when Zuikaku was commissioned into the fleet. 10 weeks, almost to the day, before the war she was built for. By October 1944, the war had narrowed to a single question, and the question was the Philippines. Japan's oil came from the Indies, and every barrel of it traveled north through the waters west of Luzon. If the Americans took the Philippines, the tankers stopped, and if the tankers stopped, the fleet became sculpture. Tokyo understood this with complete clarity. The Imperial Navy was ordered to prevent the American landing at Leyte at any cost. And the phrase, "at any cost," was not rhetoric. It was an accounting decision. The fleet was to be spent. The plan was called Shogo 1, and it divided the Navy into 3 parts, each moving separately, each expendable, all of them depending on the others arriving on time. Vice Admiral Kurita Takeo would bring the heavy guns through the San Bernardino Strait and fall on the transports. His force had already been badly handled from the air the previous day and had lost its largest battleship. Vice Admiral Nishimura Shoji, followed at a distance by Vice Admiral Shima Kiyohide, would force the Surigao Strait from the south, and Ozawa would take the carriers north with orders that were not, in any conventional sense, military orders at all. He was not asked to win an air battle, he was asked to be seen. His northern force looked substantial on paper. 4 carriers, Zuikaku, the light carrier Zuiho, and the converted Chitose and Chiyoda, 2 hybrid battleships, Ise and Hyuga, with flight decks grafted onto their sterns, a light cruiser, Oyodo, held in reserve as a flagship, 2 more cruisers, Tama and Isuzu, 8 destroyers, and spread across those 4 flight decks, 108 aircraft. That number is worth understanding properly. A single American fleet carrier, Lexington for instance, carried more than 90 aircraft by herself, and Admiral Halsey had 9 carriers within reach. Ozawa's entire carrier air strength, 4 ships combined, amounted to slightly more than 1 American flight deck. He knew it. His job was to wave those aircraft in front of the Third Fleet like a scarf. There is a reason the number was that low, and it happened 2 weeks earlier. Much of what should have been aboard those decks had already been spent over Formosa in mid-October. Zuikaku herself was not the weakness. 32,000 tons, 34 knots, armored where it mattered, with a hangar designed for 72 aircraft. Her crew had been together, in one form or another, since 1941. She had fought at Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean, at Coral Sea, at Santa Cruz, in the Solomons, and at the Philippine Sea. Her damage control party was almost certainly the most practiced afloat in any navy in the world. Nothing about the ship had gone wrong. Nothing. The trouble is that a carrier is not a ship. A carrier is an airfield that moves, and an airfield without aircrew is not a weapon. It is a target of unusual size. By October 1944, Zuikaku had aircraft in her hangar, and almost nobody left who could fly them properly. Her original air group, the men who had gone to Hawaii, were gone. Not most of them. Effectively all of them. The pilots aboard her that October had roughly 100 flying hours, some of them fewer, and a number had never put an aircraft down on a moving deck at sea. The structural failure sat one level above her, and it is the piece almost every telling of this day leaves out. Japan had no single commander at sea. Kurita, Nishimura, Shima, and Ozawa were all executing one plan while reporting to a headquarters ashore at Hiyoshi, hundreds of miles away, over a radio net, slower than the events it was describing. The entire scheme depended on one message arriving. Ozawa telling Kurita that the bait had been taken and the beaches were open. Ozawa did send that message. On the morning of the 25th, when the American strikes came in overwhelming strength, he knew with certainty that he had done exactly what was asked of him. He tried to say so. The torpedo that opened this story took out the radio that was to carry the news. Zuikaku was the flagship. Her long-range transmitter went with her steering. By the time Ozawa had shifted his flag to Oyodo and could speak to the world again, Kurita had already turned away from the transports off Sama, in part because nobody had told him the plan was working. What Ozawa felt during those 4 hours cannot be recovered. He gave testimony after the war, calmly and at length, about radar and about American strength, but he left no account of the morning itself, and any confident description of his state of mind on the bridge of a listing flagship is invention, however well written. What can be said is that he had commanded the carriers at the Philippine Sea 4 months earlier and watched 346 aircraft fail to come back over 2 days. He did not need to be told what was coming. He sailed anyway. The thing that ended her had been assembled over 3 years, and it had 3 layers. None of the 3 was a weapon in the ordinary sense. The first was radar, and the room behind it. By 1944, an American task group could detect an incoming formation at over 100 miles. Far more importantly, it had somewhere to put that information. The Combat Information Center was a darkened compartment where plotters turned radar returns into bearings, altitudes, and intercept vectors. A fighter director then spoke those vectors directly into a pilot's earphones. The doctrine had been written, argued over, and rehearsed since 1942. Its effect was that American fighters no longer searched for the enemy. They were driven to him. That is a different activity, and it produces different results. At the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the results had been made unmistakable. The first Japanese wave was detected at 150 miles. Hellcats were stacked in layers between 20 and 30,000 feet with time to spare. 42 of 69 attacking aircraft came apart in about 12 minutes. Zuikaku had been present. She had taken 1 bomb. She had also watched her sister Shokaku take 6 torpedoes from the submarine Kavala at 1,200 yards and go down. The second layer was the pilot pipeline. An American carrier pilot in 1944 reached the fleet with 300 or more hours, including live gunnery and time in the aircraft he would actually fight in. And this is the part that compounds. After a combat tour, he was rotated home to teach. Japan's system ran the other way, and ran it deliberately. Japanese aircrew arrived with under 200 hours and falling, and its veterans were flown until they did not come back, which meant every loss subtracted a teacher as well as a pilot. By late 1944, there was nobody left to train the replacements, because the trainers had been used as replacements. That is not bad luck. That is a system consuming its own seed corn. The third layer was simply industry. In 1944, the United States built roughly 35,000 fighter aircraft. Japan, across every type and purpose, managed a fraction of that. America commissioned 24 Essex-class carriers. Japan replaced Shokaku with nothing at all. The system did not need to be cleverer than Zuikaku. It only needed to be larger than her country. The man directing the strike on the 25th was Commander Hugh Winters, Air Group Commander of the USS Lexington, orbiting at 19,000 feet as target coordinator. He is not a famous name, and there is no reason he should be. He did not drop the weapon that finished her. His work was to look down at 4 Japanese carriers and decide which aircraft went where. To allocate. He was the human node of the machine, and that is rather the point of him. The system had reached a stage where its most consequential participant that morning was a man with a radio and a very good view, none of which made it a clean American day. Halsey's Third Fleet was, at the crucial hour, 300 miles from where the transports needed it to be, and one task group had already been detached towards Ulithi to replenish. Whether Halsey was deceived by Ozawa or simply chose the carriers because his orders named the Japanese fleet as his primary objective is still argued over by serious historians. Anyone who tells you it is settled is selling you something. What is not in dispute is that the strait he was covering was left open. That is where the first half of this story ends, with the bait in the water, the fish taken, and nobody in Japan yet aware that it had worked. It took 8 hours to get every name and number in this story right, because the popular version has Americans hunting Zuikaku as the last Pearl Harbor carrier. And as you will see in a moment, that is not what happened at all. If this is the history you want more of, hit like. 1 like. Nothing more. Thank you. And hit subscribe right now, because coming up is the part of this story that is almost too neat to be true. The reason the aircraft above her flew from a ship with that particular name. Do not go anywhere. Here is how the day itself ran. On the afternoon of the 24th, Ozawa did the one aggressive thing his orders allowed. He launched 76 aircraft at the American fleet, nearly 3/4 of everything he had. They achieved essentially nothing. Most never found a target, and most never came back to the carriers. The survivors carried on to Luzon and landed ashore. Zuikaku entered the morning of the 25th with a flight deck and almost nothing to put on it. The first American strike arrived a little after 8, roughly 180 aircraft. The destroyer Akizuki was hit hard and did not stay afloat. Chitose was struck badly, took a heavy list, and went under at about 9:37 in the morning. Zuiho was hit and damaged, and Zuikaku took the torpedo that begins this story. 1 hit, port side, forward of the after engine room, and with it her steering, her main radio, and a list that grew as the water spread. Then came the 4 hours that show you exactly what she was. Her damage control parties counterflooded, corrected the list, restored steering control aft, and brought her back up to nearly 20 knots. On any other day, against any other opponent, that would have been the end of the incident and the beginning of a long limp home. It was neither. At 11 o'clock Ozawa, unable to command a battle from a ship that could not transmit, transferred his flag by destroyer to the cruiser Oyodo. He left the finest carrier in his navy behind him. The second strike came in around 10 and left Chiyoda burning and stopped in the water. American cruisers finished her later that afternoon. The third strike arrived at about 1 o'clock, and it was not survivable. 6 torpedoes and 4 bombs. There is no damage control organization in any navy on Earth that answers that. The list went past 20 degrees and kept going. At 20 past 1, Zuikaku was ordered abandoned. What happened next rests on the accounts of the men who lived, and it should be recorded as their testimony rather than as documented fact. The crew who could still stand were mustered in ranks on the flight deck facing aft. The ensign was lowered. They gave 3 cheers. Captain Kaizuka Takeo did not leave. At 14 minutes past 2, she rolled onto her starboard side and went under. Zuiho followed at 3:30, and then the part almost nobody tells. The destroyer Hatsuzuki stayed behind, alone and unescorted, to bring survivors out of the water. She was found at 6:15 by 4 American cruisers and their destroyers. She fought them for about an hour, which is longer than anyone had any right to expect. She went down a little after 9 that night, taking with her the men she had just pulled from the sea. Her name appears in almost no popular account of that day. The arithmetic of the 25th reads as follows. The Americans flew 527 sorties against the Northern force. They sent down 4 aircraft carriers, a light cruiser, and 2 destroyers, and lost roughly 10 aircraft doing it. Of Zuikaku's complement of about 1,660, some 840 did not come home. Ozawa's 4 carriers put up an air defense that inconvenienced nobody. 10 aircraft for 4 carriers. That exchange rate is worth sitting with for a moment. It is not a battle result. It is what happens when one side has stopped being able to participate. Now the Lexington. On the 8th of May, 1942, in the Coral Sea, Zuikaku took 3 bombs in 90 seconds and was out of the war for months. Zuikaku was 8 miles away, hidden under a rain squall, untouched. From beneath that squall she launched the aircraft that put 2 torpedoes and 2 bombs into the USS Lexington. The damage was serious but survivable. For several hours it looked as though she would live. Then accumulated aviation gasoline vapor from ruptured lines ignited, and the fires that followed finished what Zuikaku's aircraft had started. Her own escort put torpedoes into her to send her down. It is a hard thing to ask of a crew, and it was done properly. The United States did not merely replace the ship. In June 1942, a hull already building under the name Cabot was renamed Lexington, deliberately, so that the name would not leave the fleet. She commissioned in February 1943. Tokyo Radio announced her destruction 4 separate times, which is how she came to be called the Blue Ghost. So on the 25th of October 1944, the officer circling above Zuikaku, dividing up American aircraft and deciding where they would be spent, was the air group commander of the Lexington. 2 years and 5 months after Zuikaku's pilots sent a ship of that name to the bottom, a ship of that name returned the favor. That is not a coincidence. A coincidence is an accident. This was a decision made in a committee room in Washington in 1942 and honored on a flight deck in 1944. There is an honest complication, though, and it needs saying plainly, because it is where the popular version of this story quietly cheats. Nobody off Cape Engaño was hunting the last Pearl Harbor carrier. Not Halsey, not Winters, not the pilot who put the first torpedo into her. They were attacking the biggest flight deck in sight, because that is what carrier pilots did. There is no order, no signal, no briefing note treating Zuikaku as a symbol to be settled with. The hunt is something we assembled afterwards, out of hindsight, and a very human wish for the story to have a shape. It is a true account of her end. It is not a true account of anyone's intentions, and the day cost something. Because Ozawa's bait worked, San Bernardino was open, and Kurita's battleships came through it, and fell on a handful of escort carriers and destroyer escorts off Samar. 4 small American ships were lost there to opponents they had no business being in the same ocean as. The end of Zuikaku was, in a real accounting sense, purchased with them. Here is how it unfolded in order. The 25th of September, 1941, Zuikaku commissioned at Kure. The 7th of December, 1941, her aircraft strike Oahu, and every one of them returns. The 8th of May, 1942, her aircraft send the USS Lexington to the bottom of the Coral Sea. The 19th and 20th of June, 1944, at the Philippine Sea she survives, and Japanese carrier aviation does not. The 25th of October, 1944, she is struck at 10 in the morning, abandoned at 20 past 1, and gone at 14 minutes past 2. And by 9 that evening, every ship of her force that stayed behind to help is also gone. The factors behind that outcome are worth naming plainly. The first factor was the ground she was ordered to stand on. Ozawa was sent to open ocean specifically so that he would be found, with no land-based fighter cover and no possibility of reinforcement. He accepted a position whose entire purpose was to be attacked. That is a strange thing to ask of an admiral, and he did it without complaint. The second factor was the mechanism. Radar detection, then a control room to interpret it, then a fighter director to allocate, then massed strikes in relays, so damage control never got a second hour. Each stage handed its product to the next. A ship cannot outmaneuver a process. Nobody had built a doctrine for that, because nobody had needed one. The third factor was the technology, and it was not the aeroplane, it was the ability to see. Japan built the best carrier aircraft in the world in 1941, then fought a war where knowing where the enemy was mattered more than turning inside him. The fourth factor was command. 4 Japanese admirals executed one plan with no commander at sea to coordinate them, over a radio net that failed at the exact moment it was needed. Strip away the maps and the tallies, and it comes down to a single reversal worth stating plainly. In December 1941, Zuikaku's aircraft flew 230 miles to attack an enemy who never saw them coming. In October 1944, she was located at long range by an enemy she could not see, struck by aircraft she could not intercept, and could not put enough machines into the sky to make anyone slow down. Nothing about her got worse. She was, if anything, better handled in 1944 than in 1941. What changed was that in 1941, Japan stood at her peak and America stood at her floor, and only one of those two countries could build its way out of where it was standing. That is the whole war in one sentence, and it has nothing to do with courage. Folded inside that is a second, smaller reversal that deserves to be recorded properly. The famous ship gets the headline. But the hardest thing anyone did in those waters that day was done by a destroyer. Hatsuzuki stayed alone in open water, met 4 cruisers with no realistic chance, and went down with the men she had just saved. Her name should be known. Ozawa survived and became the last commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, a post by then largely without a fleet. He gave clear-eyed testimony to American interrogators, and what he credited above all was radar. He lived until 1966. Captain Kaizuka stayed with his ship. Issei and Hyuga came through Cape Engaño untouched and were bombed into the shallows at Kure in July 1945, sitting on the bottom with their decks above water. Oyodo, the cruiser that carried Ozawa's flag away, was capsized in the same harbor in the same month. Commander Winters came home and wrote about the day in the flat, unshowy tone of a man describing paperwork. And the Lexington, the second one, the Blue Ghost, the ship Tokyo announced it had finished 4 times, served another 47 years. She is a museum at Corpus Christi, Texas, where school children walk across the same flight deck her air group flew from that morning, mostly without knowing what it was for. Zuikaku has never been found. There is no located wreck, no marked position, no photograph of her on the seabed. Somewhere in deep water northeast of Luzon, there are 840 men, and no marked place to lay a wreath. All 6 of the carriers that struck Pearl Harbor were finished by American aircraft or American torpedoes. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu at Midway, Shokaku by the submarine Kavala, and Zuikaku off Cape Engaño. Though in 2 of those cases it was Japanese destroyers that delivered the last blow to a ship already burning beyond saving, and that distinction deserves to be kept. She was the first of them to go to war, and the last of them to go under, in a battle most people who know the war well still call by the wrong name. And she is remembered instead for what happened 300 miles south of her, off Sama, where 6 little ships did something braver. The water above her is a shipping lane now. Tankers cross it, carrying the cargo she was built to protect. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because every week we tell you how America actually won its war. The perfect victories, and the ones history has quietly rewritten. Without the myths, and without the easy exaggeration. Hit subscribe, then like, so this reaches more people who should know what really happened. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We will see you in the next